June of 2020 is a monumental month for the Pokemon franchise. It signifies the release of the first actual DLC released for the mainline titles. Now, you could argue that things like Pokemon Yellow, Crystal, Emerald, and Platinum were all glorified DLC releases. And you're not technically wrong, but this is the first time DLC has been explored for already released titles. The method they had beforehand to release an entirely new game that was essentially the previous game with some new features is an outdated concept. So DLC is a much better way to handle more Pokemon content per generation, at least in my opinion. However, the DLC comes attached to arguably the most controversial Pokemon titles in history, so the questions on everyone's minds are, is this DLC worth it? Or is this just a shameless cash grab, including content that should have been included from the start, clawing its way out from the train wreck that was Sword and Shield? Those are the questions that I'm hoping to answer with my own thoughts and opinions on the first half of Sword and Shield's expansion pass, the Isle of Armor. So without any further delay, let's boot them back up. On this channel, we've already taken a look at the base game for Sword and Shield, so let's see how the DLC stacks up. It's not like they have a lot of competition, but still. So I'm going to be segmenting this video into a few separate parts, leaving any of the DLC's plot details for last, as to avoid any potential spoilers. So let's start with the Isle of Armor itself. In every sense, the Isle of Armor feels like what the wild area should have been. It's got forests, caves, beaches, depth, man-made structures, and more. The texture work is still awful, but I can overlook that if the area I'm in is interesting enough. The wild area was essentially just a lot of flat plains with a few scattered bodies of water. It felt like a wasteland. The Isle of Armor doesn't feel that way in the slightest. The forests are lush, the beaches are vast, the mountains are high, and while the caves aren't exactly interesting, it's better than not having a cave at all, I guess. I'd much rather spend time on the Isle of Armor than in the wild area. However, despite it being a more interesting area, at the end of the day, it's still a wild area, meaning that after a while, that sense of wonder kind of fades away. It's a good step in the right direction if they insist on doing these open world type areas, but it's still far from perfect. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the new features. The first one we're going to discuss is a bunch of old stuff, but it's still new to Sword and Shield, so yeah. The Isle of Armor brings back quite a few Pokemon that didn't initially make the cut when Sword and Shield first launched. Don't get me wrong, it's great that they're back, but like most people watching, I feel like they should have been included from the get-go. Now I could sit here and complain about that all day, because it does suck the big suck that not all Pokemon are added back, and while I'm not a fan of every Pokemon in the franchise, every Pokemon has its fan. And yes, that even includes the Ice Cream Cone, you Gen 5 haters. But at the end of the day, there's no turning back the clock. Like it or hate it, this is the game we've got right now. However, and this may sound like I'm white knighting Game Freak here, but for the situation we're in with Sword and Shield, they are handling it in the best way possible. Now hear me out, you don't need to buy the DLC to obtain the returning Pokemon. You can transfer them from home and receive them in trades without any issues. It's not exactly having your cake and eating it too, but again, it's just the best case scenario for the state of games that we currently have. There is, however, a bit of a gray area with that. While people will be breeding Pokemon from the DLC and shoving them out over Wonder Trade and whatnot, Pokemon like Cubfu, for example, which you only obtain one of, will more than probably not be given out so generously. So basically, if you want to obtain myths and legends that are exclusive to the DLCs, you need to pay up. This is likely going to be a much larger issue with the next half of the expansion pass. While this DLC does have Cubfu and Urshifu, who are 100% legal in official competitive matches, the Crown Tundra offers a lot more that fit that exact same bill. And if Urshifu is as much of a threat as it looks, then it's very possible this may bring a certain degree of pay-to-win to the table. At least until Game Freak decides to host some kind of event that may end up releasing Cubfu to players who don't own or can't afford the DLC. But even then, doing that may cause outrage from those who've actually bought the DLC. So either way, it's a problem. In my opinion, competitively viable Pokemon should not fall into any sort of gray areas as far as the DLC goes. So in the Isle of Armor, Urshifu is a problem. However, in the Crown Tundra, Pokemon like the 3 Kanto birds and most likely those 2 new Reggies will be competitively legal. This means that if you don't own the DLCs and, let's say, Galarian Zapdos is a driving force in the meta, you're screwed. Likewise, a lot of the returning legends that are available in the official competitive matches, for example Latios and Latias, will need that little Galar region symbol to be accepted. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's focus back on the Isle of Armor. As far as the actual new Pokemon go, there's really not a whole lot in that department. And by not a whole lot, I mean there's Cubfu and Urshifu. That's it. And yeah, there's still Slowpoke, and it can evolve into Slowbro this time, so sure, there's there's 3 new Pokemon. Now I know this is a DLC and it's not a full-fledged new game release, but when you have a character like Clara who is clearly inspired by an off-colored Dustox and she doesn't even use a standard Dustox, it's like, Game Freak, come on, what are you doing? At the very least, a handful of new Galarian forms would have been nice in my opinion. Further on from that, new Pokemon were added to raid battles. They're the same as the raids we're already used to, just with different Pokemon, so not really a whole lot to say there. There's also this new system that allows you to make Pokemon with Gigantamax potential learn to do so. So for example, if you had a Gengar that couldn't Gigantamax, then you could feed it some Max Soup, and that would allow for it to Gigantamax moving forward. This is honestly one of the best features included in the DLC, since it makes getting Gigantamax Pokemon not a pain in the half to get. The best ways to obtain Gigantamax Pokemon beforehand was to either get extremely lucky, do a raid exploit, or wait for raid events. So all in all, this is a great new feature. And on top of that, there are some new Gigantamax forms to toy around with as well. Now, if there is one complaint that I have about this feature, it's the Max Mushrooms, which is the ingredient you need to actually make the Max Suit. They spawn around the map by doing raid battles, which is fine, that makes sense, but their spawn rate is incredibly low and they can spawn in a plethora of locations on the map, so hunting them down can be a pain in its own right. Moving away from the Pokemon, the DLC included an Experience Charm, which is honestly the most useless thing the DLC has to offer. On paper, it sounds like a fine enough idea, but then you realize that the experience candies exist and that the game has been out for a long time at this point. So it's completely useless. There's new move tutors which are always nice, and some of the new moves locked behind these tutors seem pretty powerful. Maybe even a little too powerful, all things considered. This kind of goes back to what I was saying before about competitively viable Pokemon being essentially locked to the DLCs. We'll have to wait and see how useful they actually are in the coming months, although I assume Burning Jealousy will be a go-to for a lot of people. If meta-defining moves are more or less locked behind a paywall, this poses a problem for the online competitive state of the game. But again, we'll have to see whether or not they make a large impact in the coming months. And then there's my favorite thing about this entire DLC. Apricorns are back. Apricorn balls have run pretty scarce since the last time you could really obtain them in bulk was Heart Gold and Soul Silver. However, the Isle of Armor reintroduces them, and that's fantastic. I know the Pokeball isn't something a lot of players think about, but I'd personally rather catch something in a Pokeball I like the look of, rather than something that's incredibly generic. Besides, this is the only Pokemon game where the Pokeball is shoved in your face for around 5 seconds before becoming a giant Premier Ball with a pink particle effect over it. So I would like to show off my obsession for Lure Balls during those 5 seconds, since they fit a very specific color scheme. Can you guess which one? There is a bit of an issue with them though. You see, unlike Heart Gold and Soul Silver, it's not a guarantee you'll get the Apricorn ball you're looking for. Heck, more often than not, you'll end up getting anything but the ball you're looking for. Instead of taking your Apricorns to some old man and waiting for him to finish up your balls, you shove 4 into a machine that has a small chance of spitting up the Pokeball you're looking for. This makes obtaining these Pokeballs extremely frustrating. Less so than fighting the tournament in Winden over and over, but still frustrating nonetheless. Speaking of the machine you shove your acorns into, the Cramomatic was introduced, which is just a way to rid yourself of items you don't need. This thing is surprisingly more useful than I expected it to be. You can get some really good items from it. I mean, a friend of mine even got a Safari Ball. A Safari Ball. You know, that thing that hasn't been usable in a game since Heart Gold and Soul Silver, and has never been usable outside of a Safari Zone or the Great Marsh? That's a 10. There's also some new customization options, and the bike options are pretty nice, but as far as the clothing and hair options go, well, let's just say I don't want to run around the region looking like I have the personality of a tumbleweed, look like I just walked out of a Hot Topic, or cosplay as the worst Pokemon villain in history. So I think I'll stick with my Walmart bargain bin outfit. Also, instead of just adding an entirely new clothing store to the Isle of Armor itself, they're just kind of scattered about the region, which is kind of a weird choice, and it makes things a little less convenient, but Next is the restrictive sparring, which becomes available to you after you beat the story. This is kind of an interesting challenge. You're only allowed to use 3 Pokemon, and they need to be of a type that you choose. Your opponent, however, can use Pokemon of any type. You fight 5 battles in a row, and your Pokemon don't heal between the battles like in the Battle Tower. However, you're given 2 restoration chances during these 5 battles. It's very simple, but it makes for an interesting challenge. It also gives battle points, so having another outlet for those is nice too. Before we move on to the story and characters, there is one feature I do want to talk about, and I'm sure by this point in the video you've already seen it in action enough times. Your Pokemon can follow you around again. Only in the Isle of Armor though. After getting far enough in the story, Mustard will allow you to walk with the first Pokemon in your party, following you around all the time. The gripes I have with it are kinda nitpicky, but while you can see your Pokemon following you around, you never see any other players' Pokemon following them around. I do understand why. You'd have a lot of Pokemon getting stuck everywhere, they'd be losing their trainers, and the AI isn't exactly fantastic, so they do actually end up getting stuck. A lot. So while seeing everyone's Pokemon would be cool, I get why you can't. The next is that you can't ride your Pokemon like you could in Let's Go. They'll just kind of follow you around, more like Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Despite those things, it's nice to see my Pokemon follow me around again. But even then, I don't think it can be ignored that this is a buggy mess. It genuinely feels like a last-minute addition, and in its current state, it's a wonder how it even made it in at all. It's nice, but again, it's a buggy mess. That should about cover the bulk of the new additions in the Isle of Armor. There are a few smaller things like the Diglett side quest, but that'll more or less just pad out this video, and it's long enough already. So let's move on to the story. If you haven't played the Isle of Armor and don't want spoilers, then I'd recommend clicking off the video now, and maybe coming back later. If you've already played it, or just don't care, then here we go. The story can be broken down into two separate parts, training at the dojo and training with Cub Fu. When you first get to the Isle of Armor, you're greeted by Clara or Avery, depending on the game you're playing. You met a guy just before that was too scared to go to the dojo, and you get mistaken for the new student by Clara or Avery. From there, you head to the dojo, fight Mustard, begin your time as a student, and begin participating in certain trials to see who is worthy of obtaining the secret armor. It all feels very Alola. Not that Alola was bad, that's just the vibe I'm getting. The trials are honestly nothing special, with only the first one being really kinda trial-like. In the first trial, you're tasked with tracking down 3 really fast Slowpoke and defeating them, finishing the trial and taking back a dojo uniform that was stolen from your newfound rival, which they then proceed to never wear, despite them making a big fuss out of not having one. Chasing them down isn't that hard while you're on your bike, but because they all run on the exact same path, you can even just wait for them to track back and run right into you, rather than actually giving chase. From there, the next trial is to find some mushrooms in a cave. The cave is a straight line, and they're just kinda there, so it's not really a challenge at all. You do end up fighting your dojo rival, but that's not really a part of the trial itself, it's just kind of a thing that happens. The last trial is a Dynamax battle between you and your rival, since you and them were the only ones to obtain 3 max mushrooms. So you battle them, and despite them cheating, you win, and get the secret armor, which was really just Cub Fu. That's honestly about where all characters who aren't Mustard fall out of the story, and is the end of the first half, which really doesn't take that long to complete. The first half isn't terrible, but like most post-game stories we've been through in the past, it was too short. There wasn't really enough time to fully explore Clara or Avery's characters, which is a shame because there's some actual potential there if you read their league cards, but at face value they're really just upset because they're being outshined by the new kid. You don't really get to know too much about what drives them firsthand. The next half of the story revolves entirely around Cub Fu, and is by far the most disappointing part of the story. You're supposed to be befriending Cub Fu, but really what the story means by befriend is to stand still looking at things for a bit. I don't know, maybe I was expecting too much, but I was expecting something more along the lines of the relationship between the player and the partner Pokemon in the Let's Go titles. You know, like doing things like exploring the region, or in this case the island together, sharing experiences, and reacting to things together. Instead, you go to a few spots on the island and just look, I guess. Nothing interesting happens in these spots. There's no wild encounters, no conflict, no nothing. You're just standing there like... There is one instance that feels very Let's Go, and that's when you defeat whichever tower you decide to go to. I don't know, I guess I was just hoping for more of this, and less of this. Both towers play out the same way. It just depends on if you want the Rapid Strike Urshifu or the Single Strike Urshifu. The Tower of Darkness is easier, but that's just because, you know, type advantage, but they both end with a one-on-one battle with Mustard and another Cub Fu. After you finish up there, Hop decides to remind you he exists. Look, I don't hate Hop, he eventually becomes one of the better characters in Sword and Shield, but he doesn't really offer anything to this story that anyone else couldn't. Honestly, I think Hop's role here would have been better filled by Clara or Avery. That way we get to spend a little more time getting to know them a little better, and maybe even see them grow a bit as characters. Either way, the last leg of this story is to get Urshifu to Gigantamax, but since it doesn't like max mushrooms, you need to find something sweet, like sticky honey. After doing a few things and Hop forgetting what honey is, where it comes from, and seemingly eating Applin juice off my head, which is honestly just ew, You fight a Vespiquen, get the max honey, get Urshifu to Gigantamax, and fight Mustard for the last time. He'll of course be using the form of Urshifu that you didn't choose. And that about wraps up the story. It wasn't fantastic, and for a DLC story it was just okay. But it wasn't anything more than okay. Some of the characters are interesting enough though. Mustard acts as your mentor, kinda like a Pokemon professor, and has that usual stereotype of an old man being supernaturally fit. Avery and Clara essentially play the exact same role. They both want to be a gym leader and actively don't like you. Only difference is that Clara feels like an actual character, while Avery feels like a joke, constantly using wordplay of Pokemon attacks and whatnot. It was clever at first, but the act got stale very, very quickly. Clara is a toxic snob who shows some semblance of redeeming qualities, so she was alright. Avery shares those same redeeming qualities, but the awful wordplay distracts from his actual character, and a lot of it just felt forced. Clara's theme is also leagues better than Avery's. I mean, when you go from this to this, there's a clear winner here between the two. Sorry, Shield players. This also marks 4 future gym leaders for the Galar region now though. I wouldn't be surprised if we did end up getting a Sword 2 and a Shield 2 with these two as version exclusive leaders, but that's a topic for a different day. Hyde exists. He's the one who runs the Cramomatic and is the son of Honey and Mustard, which is weird because the dude is like 100 and the kid is like 8. Then there's Honey. Yeah, I kinda like her. She shows a lot of character. After simping out to her and giving her 1,000,000 watts, you're given the opportunity to fight her. There's this whole scene where the original guy who was supposed to be in this dojo comes back and she brutally attacks him off screen for being rude. So, you know, that's kind of funny. She's also the character who gives you either a Squirtle or a Bulbasaur capable of Gigantamaxing, and she'll use the one you didn't choose in battle. Her name is also Honey, and her husband's name is Mustard. Get it? It's Honey Mustard. She doesn't have her own theme though, or use any of Mustard's, so that honestly kind of blows. You'd think someone who cost 1,000,000 watts would not be defaulted to the default trainer theme, but oh well. That about covers the bulk of the DLC. There's a few smaller things that I could talk about, but this video is already longer than my Sword and Shield one, so I think it's high time I start wrapping it up. So to circle back to the questions at the start of this video, was the DLC worth it? Honestly, unless you really need a Pokemon fix, I would say it's worth skipping out on for now. If you want a new Pokemon experience, it's here, but if you're playing strictly for the competitive modes and can live without Urshifu, you're better off just transferring things from home or receiving them in trades. This wasn't a bad attempt for Game Freak's first attempt at DLC, and despite my constant griping for 20 minutes, I did enjoy it. But the Isle of Armor felt more like an appetizer, where it seems like the Crown Tundra is going to be more like the main course. Now is the DLC a shameless cash grab that includes content that should have been in the game from the start? For some things, like the returning Pokemon, the experience charm, the apricorns, and following Pokemon, yeah, you can make that argument. As for the Isle of Armor itself, no, it really doesn't. The Isle of Armor feels like something new, which is good. That's what DLC should be. It should be a new experience than what we had in the base game. And don't get me wrong, Sword and Shield lacked content, and desperately need more. And while the Isle of Armor is more content, it doesn't feel like missing content, you know? So Game Freak is, at the very least, handling that well enough. So I'll give some credit where credit is due. Not a lot though, because everything other than location could have used a lot more work. And I mean a lot more work. I've been trying to remain pretty level-headed on most things, but while some things were good enough, others really make me question their thought processes. Overall, the first half of the expansion pass was fine. Definitely not good, but it's fine. If you're still on the fence about the DLC, that's completely understandable, and if the Isle of Armor doesn't sound that enticing to you, you might want to stay on that fence for a little while longer. I don't regret my purchase. I regret buying it twice, but if I'm going to be giving these things a look into, then I need to give them their fair shot, and do everything the DLC has to offer from both sides. It's definitely not a must-have though. I think I've made that very clear throughout the course of this review. So with all that being said, I'll go ahead and end things off right now. If you liked this video, be sure to leave a like, comment, sub, the usual end of the video smooth jazz, and maybe share it around if you know someone who's also still on the fence about the DLC. Maybe I can help them make up their mind on whether it's worth it for them personally. I'd also love to hear what you all think about it, if you've played it or not, if you liked it, hated it, or if you're holding out on it for now. Either way, I'll see you in the next one. Later.